and many of his paintings depict Mount Tamalpais from Mill Valley. Here, let's look at the foreground for a minute. What do we have? We have a pool of still water. We have a path going into the picture plane. We have grazing cattle. We have oak trees in the middle ground. Uh-oh. What's that mountain doing here? You're not supposed to have a mountain in a Barbizon painting. Here, once again, we have an adaptation through an English medium watercolor using partially a French compositional strategy and a beautiful California scene in the bargain. Now, the mountain isn't painted to emphasize its grandeur, quite the opposite. The fog that comes over the mountain gives it, once again, a kind of kind and soft presence in this painting. Percy Gray. Why do I include him in this part of the lecture? Well, first of all, his grandparents and great aunts and uncles, several of them were English painters, one of them a watercolor painter. But Gray's father moved to Australia and was not a painter, and then to San Francisco. But Percy had art talent, and so he was allowed to go to the art school, the School of Design in San Francisco. And what did he do after he graduated? He got hired by the San Francisco Call as an illustrator. His work came to the attention of William Randolph Hearst, who hired him to move to New York and be a major illustrator for the New York Journal, which was Hearst's flagship newspaper in New York. So Percy came to watercolor through being an illustrator. And while in New York, he studied one summer on Shinnecock in eastern Long Island with the American Impressionist painter William Merritt Chase. Then he moved back to California in 1906 and started being an exhibiting artist rather than just an illustrator. You would think that having studied with Chase and having been in New York during the decade when Impressionism caught fire, that you would see some of that in his typical works, but you don't. What you see here is what we've seen a couple of times before. Path going into the picture plane, open foreground, a coordinated palette of related tones on the somewhat dark side, not dark side, but on the solemn side of the spectrum. You have a pool of water there. Gray was sometimes referred to as the American Corot because his preference for gray green, silver green, blue green tones were very similar to those that the French master often used. And there's another Corot element here, an element that would have been called the Corot spot, which is the roof of the farmstead, the bright accent in the middle ground that Corot often placed in the middle ground of drab paintings in order for the viewer to look into the painting. So there's a considerable French feeling here, except for the eucalyptus trees aren't French. No, we've adapted it to California again. We've taken some ideas from here and there and made them into a Californian situation. Percy was a big booster of the arts and crafts movement in Northern California during this period. And this painting is a perfect visual embodiment of the arts and crafts idea that living close to nature and away from post-industrial age cities with their pollution and stress and clamor, that was not a route to happiness. What you wanted to do was live like this. And this is the lifestyle that this painting is suggesting. Notice the rickety old fence. This also has an arts and crafts connection. It's handmade. It isn't some factory-made thing. It's something that the pioneers went out and did with their hands. And of course that with Ruskin and William Morris and all that crowd, this is what you wanted. There was a beauty in that, even though it's rickety, it is beautiful. And it also, along with the pathway, creates a sense of three dimensions out of a two-dimensional object. By the 1890s, Yosemite was tired, in fact, scorned as a subject for art. Oh, we don't do that anymore. But Percy did go to Yosemite twice, once in 1911 and once in 1921. And he painted the landmarks of Yosemite like Half Dome, I think, in a particularly interesting way. Notice how the kind of mist he's created unifies the palette so that there's harmony within all the tones of the painting. The half-dome's grandeur isn't emphasized the way it would have been had he had a deep blue sky behind it, and the half-dome would have jumped up in the air. No, it's all part of this wonderful tonalist unification. That's very different from what Albert Bierstadt or Thomas Hill would have done. In the early 20th century, Gray's friend John Gamble started painting brilliant springtime landscapes of poppies and lupin, and they caught on immediately. They were tremendously popular, quite rightly. But with Arthur Matthews and William Keith looking critically at this kind of bright painting, artists like Granville Redmond, for example, who wanted to cash in on the poppies craze, didn't really know whether they should do it or not. And early Redmond poppy paintings show poppies in deep fog. There's just fog all over the place. He's trying to have it both ways. Tonalist painting with poppies. Percy was kind of like that too. Look what he's done in this beautiful painting, done in the 1920s. The lupin are emphasized, the poppies are de-emphasized. And the lupin match up with all this wonderful blue haze that he spread throughout the eucalyptus trees to give a harmony and an emotional jolt to the image. The eucalyptus trees, it's hard to believe now, but for a long time in California, the eucalyptus was celebrated. In fact, it was thought to be a great economic factor. And Jack London, who'd made a fortune through selling his novels, almost went broke when he overinvested in the eucalyptus craze. But Giuseppe Cadenasso, the Swiss-born painter who had flourished in California, loved eucalyptus trees because they were like him. They had started somewhere else in the world and had put down roots in California. And they were the wanderers, Cadenasso, the wanderers who settled here. And he also praised the beauty of the eucalyptus crowns when they swayed in a foggy landscape. And that's part of Percy Gray's motive here. The leading woman painter at the turn of the century in watercolor was married to Neil Morgan, who was Keith's student. And so during the 1890s, so it's not surprising to find an open foreground, a pool of water, and trees in the middle ground, and a moodier painting than you would have found either 1910 or even earlier. I think the motive here is storm clearing. There's been a winter storm that's clearing in twilight, and the delicate red sunset in the clouds is showing a kind of revelation of beauty and moisture. And this painting was highly celebrated when it was exhibited at the Art Association. It was reproduced in the Mark Hopkins Institute publication of that year that covered the show that this painting was in. In 1901, an event occurred in San Francisco that gave a big boost to watercolor painters. The San Francisco Art Association restricted its autumn exhibition entirely to watercolors and oil studies. The reason for this was the rise of the Bohemian Club's December exhibition, which was more lucrative for the local landscape painters with their big paintings. They tended to send them to the Bohemian Club where they would sell easier. And after a while, the autumn exhibition of the Art Association became kind of the leftovers when it came to the major oil paintings. So they decided to change and give a boost to the watercolor painters, because quite a few of them had come into view by 1901. And between 1901 and 1908, the watercolor painters in San Francisco really had their own show. One of these painters that came to the fore in the early 20th century was Chris Jorgensen. Jorgensen was born in Norway, came to San Francisco with his widowed mother, went to work as a janitor at the School of Design in his teenage years, started fooling around with drawings. They came to the attention of Virgil Williams, the director of the school. Wow, this guy can do it. Williams arranged a scholarship for Jorgensen. Jorgensen was a great pupil. When he graduated, he worked for a year in an architect's office before becoming a teacher. teaching watercolor. One of his students was Angela Ghirardelli, the daughter of the chocolate manufacturer. And they fell in love and got married. That put an end to Jorgensen's money worries. But he kept on painting in watercolor and teaching in watercolor. Some of his early paintings, and there's a beautiful one, I don't have an image of it for this lecture, shows marine activities around San Francisco Bay. He did a lot of paintings of that. Then in 1899, Angela said to Chris, let's go to Yosemite. What? We don't go to Yosemite, and we don't paint Yosemite anymore. Angela said, we don't have to paint it. Just go there. If you live in California, you got to go to Yosemite at least once. So I said, oh, okay. And he was just totally taken over by the scenery there, and created a whole bunch of small-scale watercolors of the icons of Yosemite Valley, like the one on the screen, that he brought back to San Francisco in the fall of 1899. And the reaction was this: painters of flowers revel in the delicate, brighter medium of watercolor, but most people wouldn't think of painting a rock a mile high in watercolor. This was the experiment that Jorgensen tried this summer. It was entirely successful. Here we had a different kind of Yosemite painting. It wasn't this big, nationalistic, bragging, manifest destiny idea. It was more shrinking the beauty of Yosemite into smaller, more humble formats. The painting sold, quote, like hotcakes, unquote, to the local art patrons. Jorgensen went back the next year. The next summer, he was able to build a lodge on the valley floor, where he went every summer until 1915. In 1904, Angela and Chris hired a horse and buggy and visited all the Franciscan missions, and Jorgensen did a complete set of mission paintings that was exhibited in Washington that year and was highly successful. Remember, he had spent a year as an architectural draftsman. He was very, very comfortable with buildings, painting buildings. Well, they were in Carmel. They just loved the place, painting the Carmel mission. So they built a house there. They lived there in the wintertime and Yosemite in the summer. And Jorgensen painted some of the major historic buildings in Monterey, like the Custom House. Notice how we don't have, if this had been a Charles Rollo Peters painting, it would be a moonlight scene with romantic light flooding down and wonderful candles kind of flickering through the windows, and we don't see that at all here, or any nostalgic sunset behind the building or anything. It's just the building just made into a work of art with incredibly exquisite, believable draftsmanship, slight altering of tones to make it all hang together better, and just a lovely work of art. In 1916, the Jorgensens visited their son, who was a student at Harvard, and this time they chartered a limousine, no more horse and buggy, in 1916, and drove through New England. And Chris did little studies of New England scenery for his own pleasure, like this painting here, and then there's several of them in the show that are absolutely exquisite. Jorgensen never sold them, he kept them, as I think, as memories of the trip. They ended up in the Yosemite Museum after he died, and I got a bunch of them through a trade and sold a couple to Roger, and so we have some really nice ones here in the show. L.P. Latimer was another painter who came to watercolor through his role as a teacher. He was the son of a very eminent lawyer and judge who sent him to the art school in the 1880s, where he excelled, and then upon graduation he became a teacher, teaching in watercolor, and through that route he did his best work in watercolor. In the 1880s he became part of the entourage of the flamboyant French-trained painter Jules Tavernier, and Tavernier was the first local artist to take the redwoods forest seriously as a subject for art. Tavernier was deeply immersed in the Barbizon aesthetic, having been in Paris when it was at the top of its popularity. And here's a wood interior, okay? Not the forest of Fontainebleau. But when you substitute redwoods for oak trees, you get a sense of grandeur that's totally alien to the moody, kind of soulful mood of the oak trees. So you still have the vestiges of the composition, with the creek being the path that goes into the picture, playing the open foreground. But by 1901, Latimer also lightened up his palette quite a lot, and produced beautiful green harmonies from the foliage of the redwoods. And when he wrote an article for the Overland Monthly, he said, "Who can go to the redwood forest and not come out refreshed and reinvigorated?" And this expressed the moral basis for virtually all landscape paintings of the second half of the 19th century and early 20th century. The idea that going to nature to be refreshed and have your soul cleansed from the dirty nastiness of city life, this was a premise that was widely shared. And we may not have the metaphysical beliefs that they had, or the religious beliefs, but I think we still do it. I just got back from the Sierra, and I feel rather refreshed. And anyway, the paintings were a surrogate for that experience. You put these paintings in your urban living room, and while staring at them, you could get some of the same rewards that you could get by actually going that uncomfortable wagon ride to Sonoma or wherever. You could just dispense with that and buy a Latimer painting. Latimer grew up in Windsor, California, just north of Santa Rosa, and he loved that countryside, and often would take his students into Northern California, especially to Cazadero, where there was a wonderful rural hotel called Trosper's. Unfortunately, Trosper's burned down in the 1920s, I think. Latimer believed that an artist did his best work painting subjects that had strong emotional appeal, and he pointed that out in an article he wrote for the San Francisco Call. But look what he's done to this little painting of a favorite subject. The palette has been restricted to red and green tones. The red of the pathway of the road is echoed in the hillside. It's also present in slightly different tonalities in the terrain in the foreground. And then the greens of various tones are once again find an echo. There's been a compression. This isn't a colored photograph. This is an artistic interpretation of nature, but the trick is to make it credible. And it's charming and believable. It's not so stylized that you would say, "Oh my God, I couldn't possibly go to such a place," but it works. And this to me is the touchstone of all great art. Get it right and make it better than right. And the tension between those two poles. A lot of the best art, whether it's Madonna's, it's supposed to be the mother of God, but an ordinary woman. Okay, there's a challenge that artists had to face. Many of them successfully passed that test. Like Jorgensen, Latimer wasn't afraid to go to the mountains and paint mountain scenery. Matthews, McComas, those guys never went close to the Sierra, or painted it anyway. Latimer went to Yosemite in 1912 and loved it. There's a wonderful Yosemite Latimer in the show, watercolor painting. But then in 1914, he went up to Fallen Leaf Lake for the first time, and just in the southwest corner of Lake Tahoe, just loved both the lake and the backcountry, and painted lovely works like this. Keith's Dome, not named after William Keith, but after a pioneer named Keith. In the backcountry behind Fallen Leaf Lake. Once again, look at the colors here. We have this taupe and lavender pathway. No pathway was like that in the Sierra. We don't have lavender tree trunks either. But when I look at that painting, I'm out there. I'm thinking I'm walking along that trail. You get back from it, and it just has this kind of magic to it that these slight modifications increase rather than make you think that you're not simply looking at something real. Finally, Gunnar Woodforce came to San Francisco and Yosemite in 1921 from a very different background from any of the other watercolor painters. By 1921, art like this was really not supposed to be painted anymore, but he didn't care. In Sweden in the 19th century, there were several really wonderful watercolor painters. Those of you who went to the Andrew Zorn show last year saw one of the best. Zorn was an amazing painter in watercolor and portraits. And Woodforce was very conscious of Zorn's world's famous celebrity because he told an interviewer at the end of his life that one of his proudest moments was learning that Anders Zorn had purchased one of Woodforce's watercolors. Anyway, Swedish background. He went up to Yosemite. He didn't care that you weren't supposed to paint it anymore. He painted it. He spent a whole year there from 21 to 22. The painting works like this beautiful view of Half Dome as seen from the trail. Half Dome is just an incidental detail in the background. What does that do? It increases the credibility. I think you're walking along the trail, and there's Half Dome in the background. Look, though, at, once again, I should show you the colors here. All those blue shadows in the foreground and the shadows of the tree leaves, how they coordinate with the blue rocks over here and the distant rocks. And then Half Dome itself, the same chord, the tones are slightly attenuated by the atmosphere. It just has this beautiful, harmonious impression. Woodforce spent the winter of 21-22 in Yosemite. One reporter mentioned that he was a devil when it came to winter sports. And he also told the guests at the Yosemite Lodge where he was staying that he loved Yosemite winter because it was so clear. The atmosphere was so clear, it reminded him of Sweden. He said that's why Swedish paintings are so clear and bright, is because we live in that kind of atmosphere, and this reminds me very strongly of that. And you can see in this beautiful painting of a wintertime in Yosemite, you can hardly capture the clarity and the coolness and the beauty of the scene any more heroically than what you see here. In 1925, Woodforce, who by then was living in San Francisco, went to Humboldt County to paint the redwoods. And the critic of the Oakland Tribune, as he was departing, said, "Woodforce paints with photographic detail. His redwoods, if painted in the same manner, will come in for a fine scorching should he exhibit them in these parts." Yes, finally the modernist movement was taking over. Well, photographic, I don't think you see much of a photograph in this wonderful dappled harmony of different tones that, yes, there are redwood trees, but I don't think you could make a photograph of this terribly well. Anyway, and that separates why I think art is a little more interesting aesthetically than even great photography. When he got back, Mr. Dungan said, there will be those who quarrel with Woodforce because he has reproduced faithfully the things that he sees. Well, semi-faithfully. After all, and this guy's finally catching on, after all, isn't it better to paint well the thing itself than to attempt the spirit of it and get only a gibbering ghost of nothing? I like him. I like the guy. And what I almost did, which I luckily decided not to do, was have a John Marin watercolor, which is a kind of a very vague coast scene. And those things sell for $500,000. You can't give these guys away. Anyway, I didn't do it. And I didn't mention it either, did I? Finally, another painter who came along too late to be celebrated because of the modernist takeover was Karl Simmons, who came of age in the 1920s, painting in pastel. And I include him in the show because pastel is like watercolor. It's unforgiving. It's on paper, small scale for the most part. And there's some very beautiful ones. And those of you who remember the Karl Simmons show here from a couple of years ago, will just remember what a great artist Simmons was in small formats. But like Woodforce, and like all the painters I've been talking about, by the 1930s, the modernists had just taken all of these paintings off the board. They weren't fashionable anymore. Simmons had to satisfy himself selling paintings out of gift shops. He could do that. People wanted the paintings because they were so beautiful. So he could make some kind of a living as an artist, as could Percy Gray, who continued to paint until the 1950s, and other traditional artists. What they didn't get anymore was the tiniest bit of critical acclaim or reputation as being good artists, which their talent should have earned them. And I ended the way I began, by saying that I hope that this show particularly will demonstrate that these painters were very good watercolor painters, as good as any other watercolor painters working in the world. This is a little part of California, early California culture that should be celebrated. We should be proud of it instead of avoiding it because we're frightened of being called provincial, which is the worst kind of provincialism itself. We should be celebrating it because the art is very good, and it covers beautiful California scenes that mean a lot to all of us. Thank you. Does anyone want to have a question? Yeah.
Did Jorgensen tend to do his watercolors in small?
Mostly in small formats. He also was an oil painter. I don't think his oils really measure up. Some of them are fairly good, but they don't have the magic that the watercolors have. And most of them are 14 by 10 inches or sometimes 16 by 24 inches. But I don't think I remember seeing a watercolor by Jorgensen much larger than that. Roger. The East Coast watercolor painters, the ones I'm familiar with, well, of course, it was Winslow Homer and Thomas Moran that stayed popular into the early 20th century because they had such huge reputations. William Trost Richards was also quite popular until the turn of the century, but I think by 1920, Richards had been basically forgotten. He was only rediscovered in the 1960s when there was a new generation of art historians that went back and looked at these paintings and said, wow, they're good. Why did we ever think they weren't? They're not modern paintings, but then neither is Constable, neither is Giorgione. Yeah?
I'd like to ask the carvers, how do they determine what to collect?
Well, I look at some of these and I don't even know where they were. So it's Mr. Carter.
Well, candidly, it's listening and observing and watching what people like Alfred do. And, hey, I make mistakes. But I really do. We've got a lot of fun. People that are more knowledgeable than I am. And I mean, honestly, there are many of these things that I had no idea until I just listened to Alfred talk about it. But why you collect them? You're looking for them. But they're beautiful, and I've always had a lot of confidence in Alfred and others to lead me the right way.
No, that really overemphasizes my role. Roger's been collecting for years without my input. He just is one of these guys that has a super sense of the beautiful. And the watercolor collection is only a minor part of his overall collection. And he has collections of early Utah art, of wonderful oil paintings done in California. There are collectors like that. Maxim Karalik, for example, at the beginning of the 1950s, saw the virtue in Fitzhenry Lane and Martin Johnson Head and these other artists who've been totally forgotten and swept into attics and basements. There are collectors like that. There's Barbara Milhouse in Renolda House in Virginia, the granddaughter of R.J. Reynolds, who had enough money to collect on a rather big scale, but she collected Thomas Cole, Frederick Church in the 1960s. What was he putting that schlock in the Renolda House for? Now people come from all over the country to see that house. And Roger's that quality.
And Alfred promised me, he guaranteed me one day that will happen.
I told him that his paintings were going to quadruple in value, but he'd have to wait another 150 years. Well, Jorgensen, of course, did watercolors, but Armin Hansen was basically an oil painter. McComas was based in Monterey for most of his career, and he was a watercolor painter. Charles Rollo Peters was basically an oil painter. He had a place, and there were several other artists in his circle that also were oil painters. It was a mixture.
Yeah. Well, there's a woman artist named Rowena
Abdi, right.
And did she also do some watercolors, or was she?
You know, her works are so rare that I've seen one over the 30 years I've been in the gallery,
There's one in the Monterey.
but you very seldom see them on the market, so I can't answer that. I know she was good. She was a wonderful painter. Yeah.
I have one more question.
Yeah.
Are in the Carter collection that's on exhibit, are those the original frames?
No. They are wonderful frames, and that's one of the great pleasures.
They're similar to the original.
But they are period frames. They're frames that people would. I think what distinguishes this show, which I think is utterly delightful, it's a dream come true for me to see all of these beautiful paintings. But what distinguishes, I've been to watercolor shows with Winslow Homers and Thomas Morans, and they come from major museums in nasty white mats and cheap frames. And you have to not, if you're like me, you have to not see the presentation, just try to see the art, it's all the art. Here, everything is perfect. It's wonderful.
Yeah, I want to thank Alfred for his wonderful presentation. I learned a lot today. I always learn from Alfred. So I expect to keep learning from him in the years to come. But now I want to invite you all down to our patio for our reception down there. Give you a chance to walk through the shows again. And I'm sure that Alfred is perfectly willing to answer any of your questions. So join us, won't you? Thank you.
One more thing, one logistical thing. If you've already paid your admission to the museum, please find me or my student worker Emily and we'll give you a blue sticker so you don't have to pay again, okay? Thank you. Please join us for a reception on the patio.